March 16th, 1244. 200 people walk down a mountainside in southern France, hand in hand, toward a pyre already burning below. No one drags them. No soldier forces them forward. They chose this morning weeks earlier and never once asked for more time. To understand why, you have to understand what they believed the world actually was. Not God's creation, but a prison built by the devil himself, with your own body as the cell. This is the story of the Cathars, the ritual that promised to finally set them free, and the Pope, who built history's first religious secret police for the sole purpose of making sure that promise could never be fulfilled. In the closing decades of the 12th century and the opening years of the 13th, the region of Languedoc in the south of France stood as one of the most culturally sophisticated, economically prosperous, and religiously tolerant regions anywhere in Latin Christian Europe. Its cities hosted a flourishing courtly culture of troubadour poetry. Its aristocracy maintained a degree of political independence from the French crown to the north that made the region function almost as its own distinct political world, and its population, accustomed to considerable religious and intellectual diversity, proved unusually receptive to a religious movement that would, within a generation, provoke one of the most violent and consequential campaigns of religious suppression in medieval European history. That movement is known to history as Catharism, a name derived from the Greek word katharoi, meaning the pure ones, though the movement's own adherents more commonly referred to themselves simply as good Christians or good men and women. At the theological core of Catharism lay a belief system historians classify as dualist, a framework holding that the universe was not the product of a single, all-powerful, and wholly benevolent God, as Orthodox Catholic theology maintained, but was instead the contested product of two opposing divine principles, one entirely good and one entirely evil, locked in permanent cosmic conflict. The good principle, in Cathar theological understanding, had created an entirely spiritual realm, a heaven of pure light and immaterial being, populated by souls that existed originally as angels or spiritual beings without physical bodies of any kind. The evil principle, whom Cathar teaching identified variously as Satan, or by the Latin title Rex Mundi, meaning King of the World, was understood to be the creator and ruler of the entire physical, material universe, the earth itself, the natural world, and, most consequentially for how Cathar believers understood their own daily existence, the human body. This theological framework produced a correspondingly distinctive understanding of human existence and its ultimate purpose. Cathar teaching held that human souls were, in their original nature, angels or spiritual beings who had been captured, seduced, or otherwise trapped by the evil principle and imprisoned within physical bodies. Material vessels understood not as morally neutral biological containers, but as active instruments of demonic imprisonment, specifically designed and maintained by Satan to keep spiritual beings separated from their true home in the immaterial realm of light. The implications of this framework for how Cathar believers understood the physical world around them were considerably more radical than the comparatively modest ascetic traditions found within mainstream medieval Catholic monasticism, which generally treated bodily discipline and material renunciation as spiritually beneficial practices undertaken within a universe still understood as fundamentally good, created by a single benevolent God whose material creation, while capable of misuse through human sin, was not itself inherently evil. Cathar teaching went considerably further, holding that the physical world itself, not merely human moral failing within it, but the very fabric of physical, material existence, was the direct creation and ongoing dominion of an evil, opposing divine power. The ultimate goal of human existence, within this theological framework, was not the resurrection of the body that Orthodox Christian teaching anticipated, but rather the complete and permanent liberation of the spiritual soul from its physical, material prison, allowing that liberated spirit to return to its true home in the immaterial realm of light, without any further cycle of reincarnation into new physical bodies. A fate Cathar teaching held would otherwise await souls that failed to achieve this liberation before death, condemning them to repeated cycles of rebirth into new bodily prisons until they finally achieved the spiritual purity necessary for permanent release. This cosmology, whatever its ultimate theological and philosophical merits or shortcomings by the standards of any particular religious tradition evaluating it, provided the essential conceptual foundation for everything that would follow in Cathar religious practice and daily life. The strict dietary regulations, the rejection of procreation, and the extraordinary two-tiered social structure that distinguished ordinary Cathar believers from the small, spiritually elite class of individuals who had fully committed themselves to the religion's most demanding requirements. It also, as the following episodes will document in detail, provided Catholic authorities in Rome with theological grounds for regarding Catharism not simply as a variant or reform movement within Christianity, but as a fundamentally distinct and, in Rome's judgment, thoroughly heretical religious system that could not be tolerated to continue spreading unchecked across territory nominally under Catholic ecclesiastical authority. Historians studying the broader intellectual origins of Cathar dualist theology have traced plausible lines of influence extending back through several centuries and across a considerable geographic distance, connecting the movement to earlier dualist religious traditions, including the Bogomils, a similar dualist Christian movement that had flourished in the Balkans, particularly in Bulgaria, beginning in the 10th century, and, more distantly still, to the Manichaean religious tradition that had spread across the late Roman world from Persian origins many centuries earlier, itself drawing on even older Zoroastrian dualist concepts of cosmic conflict between light and darkness. Whether Catharism represented a direct, traceable line of missionary transmission from these earlier dualist traditions, carried westward through trade routes and religious contact across the Balkans and into Western Europe, or whether it developed as a more independent theological response to genuine dissatisfaction with perceived corruption within the medieval Catholic Church, arriving at broadly similar dualist conclusions through its own separate intellectual development, remains a subject of genuine ongoing scholarly debate among historians specializing in this period. What is not in serious dispute is that by the time Catharism achieved its greatest popular strength throughout Languedoc in the final decades of the 12th century, it had developed into a genuinely coherent, internally consistent religious system with its own distinctive scriptures, ritual practices, and social organization, not merely a loose collection of anti-Catholic grievances, but a fully formed alternative Christian tradition commanding the sincere, committed belief of a substantial portion of the regional population. If the physical body represented, as established in the previous episode, a demonic prison constructed specifically to trap spiritual beings within material existence, then Cathar theology confronted an immediate and practically consequential logical extension of this belief. Any act that created new physical bodies, thereby providing the evil principle with additional prisons in which to trap additional liberated or yet unliberated spiritual souls, represented one of the gravest possible moral transgressions available to a believer. This theological reasoning placed human procreation itself at the very center of Cathar moral concern, regardless of whether that procreation occurred within the sanctioned bounds of Catholic marriage or outside it. Where orthodox medieval Catholic theology distinguished carefully between marital sexuality, understood as a legitimate and even sacramentally blessed component of married life, intended partly for the purpose of procreation, and sexual activity outside marriage, understood as sinful, Cathar theology drew no such distinction. Sexual activity of any kind, married or unmarried, was understood as fundamentally sinful precisely because of its potential to create new physical bodies and thereby extend the material prison system the evil principle had constructed to trap spiritual beings. This foundational theological position regarding procreation extended logically into an equally strict and comprehensive system of dietary regulation that governed the daily life of committed Cathar believers, particularly the spiritually elite class of individuals known as the perfecti, whose distinctive social role the following episode will examine in considerably greater detail. Cathar dietary law prohibited the consumption of meat, animal fat, eggs, milk, and cheese, essentially every food product that derived, directly or indirectly, from animal reproduction and animal life. The theological logic underlying this comprehensive dietary restriction followed directly from the broader Cathar understanding of procreation as inherently sinful, since meat, eggs, and dairy products were all understood to derive from animals that had themselves been produced through the same sexual reproduction that Cathar theology condemned as facilitating the evil principle's ongoing project of trapping spiritual beings in physical bodies. Consuming these products was understood to implicate the consumer in that same underlying sinful process, however indirectly. Cathar teaching additionally held that animals themselves might, in certain cases, house souls that had not yet achieved sufficient spiritual purity to be reborn into human form, meaning that the consumption of meat carried the additional theological risk of consuming a fellow trapped spiritual being who happened, through the ongoing cycle of reincarnation Cathar theology anticipated for insufficiently purified souls, to currently occupy an animal body rather than a human one. Fish represented a notable and theologically consistent exception to this otherwise comprehensive prohibition on animal products, permitted within Cathar dietary practice because medieval European natural philosophy, following classical precedents that had not yet been superseded by more accurate biological understanding, generally held that fish reproduced through spontaneous generation directly from water rather than through the kind of sexual reproduction that governed land animals and birds, a scientifically inaccurate belief by modern biological understanding, but one that nonetheless provided a theologically coherent basis within the internal logic of Cathar belief for permitting fish consumption while prohibiting meat, eggs, and dairy products derived from animals whose reproductive process was correctly understood to involve conventional sexual generation. What remained permissible within this comprehensive dietary framework consisted primarily of vegetables, fruits, grains, bread, water, and wine, a dietary pattern that, considered simply as a matter of nutritional content and daily practice, anticipated by many centuries the kind of plant-based dietary regimen that would eventually achieve renewed popularity in considerably different philosophical and health-oriented contexts many centuries later, though the underlying motivation driving Cathar dietary practice bore no meaningful resemblance to the health, environmental, or animal welfare considerations that typically motivate modern plant-based dietary choices. Beyond these comprehensive dietary restrictions, Cathar religious practice additionally incorporated a regular pattern of formal fasting, generally observed 3 days each week, during which even the already restricted range of permitted foods was further limited or entirely withheld for extended periods. This fasting practice served, within Cathar theological understanding, the additional purpose of actively subduing bodily appetite and desire, treating hunger itself as a spiritually productive form of discipline specifically intended to weaken the physical body's demands and thereby loosen, at least symbolically and to whatever extent Cathar believers understood this process to have genuine spiritual efficacy, the evil principle's grip over the imprisoned spiritual soul housed within that same disciplined, deliberately weakened physical body. The practical day-to-day experience of maintaining these dietary restrictions deserves some additional consideration. because it illustrates just how thoroughly Cathar religious commitment shaped the ordinary rhythms of daily life for those who fully embraced the movement's ascetic requirements. Medieval Languedoc's agricultural economy, like most of medieval Europe, depended heavily on animal products for both nutrition and economic activity. Dairy farming, egg production, and meat from livestock represented significant components of the regional diet and rural economy alike. A perfectus or perfecta observing full Cathar dietary law was therefore choosing a diet that stood in genuine, visible contrast to the eating habits of virtually everyone else in their surrounding community, a contrast that would have been immediately apparent at any shared meal, market transaction, or communal gathering, reinforcing at every turn the perfecti's distinct spiritual status through the simple, unavoidable visibility of what they would and would not eat. This visible dietary distinction, as later episodes in this series will demonstrate, would eventually prove significant for entirely different and considerably more dangerous reasons. Once Catholic ecclesiastical authorities began systematically using precisely this kind of observable dietary behavior as practical evidence in their efforts to identify households harboring continued Cathar religious sympathy. The comprehensive and genuinely demanding requirements of full Cathar religious practice, permanent sexual abstinence, comprehensive dietary restriction, and regular formal fasting, among other requirements this series' later episodes will examine, proved, understandably, impractical for the majority of ordinary believers who found themselves drawn to Cathar teaching, but who continued living conventional lives involving marriage, family responsibility, and ordinary economic activity within the broader agricultural and commercial society of medieval Languedoc. Cathar religious and social organization addressed this practical tension through a distinctive two-tiered structure that historians studying the movement have identified as one of its most sociologically significant and, in certain respects, genuinely innovative features relative to conventional medieval Catholic religious practice. The larger group, known as the credentes, or believers, consisted of ordinary adherents who accepted Cathar theological teaching and maintained sympathetic association with the movement while continuing to live essentially conventional lives, marrying, raising children, eating meat and other prohibited foods, and generally participating in ordinary medieval social and economic life without attempting to observe the full range of ascetic requirements the religion's core theology technically demanded of a fully committed believer. The smaller, spiritually elite group, known as the perfecti, a Latin term meaning the perfected ones, though the group's own members more commonly used the simpler designation good men and good women, consisted of individuals who had undergone a specific initiation ritual, examined in detail in the following episode, that formally and permanently committed them to observing the complete range of Cathar ascetic requirements for the remainder of their natural lives. Perfecti maintained strict permanent celibacy, observed the comprehensive dietary restrictions detailed in the previous episode without exception, renounced all personal property and material possessions, and typically spent their lives traveling in pairs from village to village throughout Languedoc, providing religious instruction and spiritual guidance to the broader community of ordinary believers who supported and sheltered them in exchange for this spiritual leadership and instruction. The relationship between these two tiers deserves careful examination, because it illuminates precisely why Catharism achieved such genuine and widespread popular support throughout Languedoc society, cutting across social classes to include significant sympathy and support even among the regional aristocracy who might, in a more conventional medieval religious landscape, have been expected to align more consistently with established Catholic ecclesiastical authority. Ordinary believers were not required to achieve the demanding spiritual perfection the perfecti maintained in order to participate meaningfully in Cathar religious life and community. Their primary religious obligations involved providing material support, protection, and hospitality to the travelling perfecti, along with maintaining general sympathetic adherence to Cathar teaching, while hoping to eventually receive the specific ritual of spiritual liberation that the following episode will examine in detail, ideally, though not necessarily at some point before their own eventual death. The perfecti themselves earned genuine, widespread popular respect and admiration throughout Languedoc society, that historians studying this period consistently note exceeded the reputation enjoyed by much of the contemporary Catholic clergy operating in the same region during this period, where conventional medieval Catholic parish priests and, particularly, the higher ecclesiastical hierarchy were frequently associated in popular perception with considerable material wealth, political entanglement, and, in numerous well-documented instances, outright moral corruption and personal indulgence that stood in uncomfortable tension with the ascetic ideals Christian teaching nominally espoused. The perfecti lived lives of genuine, visible material poverty and moral discipline that impressed observers throughout Languedoc society, reinforcing the movement's broader claim to represent authentic Christian spiritual practice, in contrast to what its adherents regarded as the corrupted, worldly institution centered in Rome. A further distinctive feature of Cathar social organization, genuinely unusual by the standards of virtually every other major medieval European religious tradition, involved the movement's approach to gender and spiritual authority. Women could become perfecti on essentially equal theological and practical terms with male perfecti, undertaking the same initiation ritual, observing the same ascetic requirements, and exercising the same religious teaching and spiritual guidance functions within their communities that male perfecti performed. A genuinely significant departure from the conventional medieval Catholic restriction of formal priestly authority and sacramental function to men alone, and one that historians studying the movement's broader popular appeal have identified as a meaningful contributing factor in Catharism's particular success in attracting committed female adherents and leaders across Languedoc society during this period. Achieving and maintaining status as a perfectus or perfecta, however, carried genuinely severe and permanent consequences for any subsequent moral failure. Cathar theology held that any violation of the strict ascetic requirements governing perfecti life, even a single instance of consuming a prohibited food, or any lapse from permanent celibacy, permanently and irrevocably forfeited the spiritual purity the initiation ritual had conferred, a consequence that, as the following two episodes will document in considerable detail, produced genuinely severe and, by any modern standard, disturbing practical consequences for believers who received this transformative ritual while suffering from serious illness, only to then experience the genuinely awkward theological problem of subsequently unexpectedly recovering their health. The economic and social dimension of the relationship between credentes and perfecti also deserves attention here, since it reveals a genuinely sophisticated system of mutual obligation that helped sustain Cathar religious infrastructure across generations without any of the formal institutional apparatus, church buildings, endowed properties, or centralized administrative hierarchy that supported the Catholic Church's own parallel network throughout the same region. Ordinary believers frequently provided lodging, food, and physical protection to traveling perfecti as they moved between villages, effectively functioning as a decentralized support network that allowed the movement's spiritual leadership to sustain itself, despite the perfecti's own formal renunciation of personal property and material wealth. Wealthy credentes among the regional nobility sometimes went considerably further, donating land or resources to support Cathar religious activity more broadly, or using their political influence to shield known Cathar communities from unwelcome attention by Catholic ecclesiastical authorities. This entire support structure depended on a level of genuine, sustained popular trust and commitment that historians studying the movement consistently identify as remarkable, given the total absence of any of the coercive institutional mechanisms, mandatory tithes, legal privilege, or state enforcement, that helped sustain Catholic religious practice throughout the rest of medieval Europe during this same period. At the theological and ritual center of Cathar religious practice stood a single sacrament known as the consolamentum, a Latin term generally translated as consolation or comforting, through which an ordinary believer formally and permanently transitioned into the elevated, spiritually purified status of perfectus or perfecta, examined in the previous episode. Understanding this ritual's specific mechanics, theological significance, and practical consequences is essential to understanding everything that follows in this series' remaining episodes, since the consolamentum's particular combination of transformative spiritual power and permanently binding practical requirements would eventually produce some of the most historically striking and, to modern audiences, genuinely startling practices documented anywhere in medieval European religious history. Cathar theology explicitly and comprehensively rejected the Catholic sacrament of water baptism, on grounds directly consistent with the broader dualist cosmology examined in this series' first episode. Since water was understood as a material, physical substance, and the entire physical world was understood to be the creation and ongoing dominion of the evil principle rather than the good, spiritual God, water baptism could not, in Cathar theological reasoning, serve as an effective instrument of genuine spiritual purification or salvation, however central this sacrament remained to Orthodox Catholic religious practice throughout the rest of medieval Christendom. In place of water baptism, Cathar religious practice centered on the consolamentum, understood as a baptism of the Spirit rather than of physical water, conferred through a ritual involving the physical placement of a copy of the Gospel of John upon the recipient's head, accompanied by the laying on of hands and formal prayers offered by perfecti who had themselves previously received the same sacrament from earlier generations of perfecti extending back, in Cathar religious understanding, in an unbroken chain of spiritual transmission to the earliest, most authentic form of Christian religious practice, which Cathar teaching held had been corrupted and abandoned by the institutional Catholic Church centered in Rome. The consolamentum's theological significance and practical power within Cathar religious understanding were genuinely comprehensive and consequential. The ritual was understood to cleanse the recipient of all accumulated sin from across their entire life, and more radically, from across whatever previous cycles of reincarnation their soul might have already experienced in its ongoing journey toward eventual spiritual liberation from material existence. Having received the consolamentum, a believer's soul was understood to be guaranteed direct, immediate passage to the spiritual realm of light upon their eventual physical death, without any further requirement of continued reincarnation into new physical bodies. This transformative spiritual power, however, came bound to requirements of genuinely severe and permanently binding practical consequence, requirements that distinguish the consolamentum sharply from the conception of religious sacraments generally understood within Orthodox Catholic theology, where sacramental grace, once conferred, generally remained effective regardless of the recipient's subsequent moral conduct, which might separately affect their spiritual standing without retroactively nullifying the original sacrament itself. Cathar theology held, by contrast, that the consolamentum's spiritual benefits remained conditional upon the recipient's subsequent, permanent maintenance of full perfecti-level ascetic discipline for the remainder of their natural life. Permanent celibacy, comprehensive dietary restriction, and complete renunciation of material property and worldly entanglement, observed without exception or lapse from the moment of receiving the ritual until the moment of physical death. Any subsequent violation of these requirements, according to Cathar theological understanding, would retroactively nullify the consolamentum's spiritual benefits entirely, returning the unfortunate believer to precisely the same spiritually unresolved condition they had occupied before receiving the ritual in the first place, with their accumulated sin unforgiven and their soul once again subject to the ongoing cycle of reincarnation into new physical bodies that the ritual had originally been intended to permanently resolve. This theological structure created an entirely predictable and, based on the available historical evidence, genuinely widespread practical pattern among ordinary Cathar believers throughout Languedoc society. Rather than receiving the consolamentum during ordinary health and then attempting to maintain the ritual's genuinely demanding permanent requirements across what might otherwise remain many additional years or decades of normal adult life, the substantial majority of ordinary believers instead chose to delay receiving the consolamentum until they found themselves on what they and their surrounding community judged to be their genuine deathbed, suffering from illness or injury believed to be imminently fatal. Receiving the ritual under these specific circumstances offered the theological benefit of the consolamentum's comprehensive spiritual purification and guaranteed liberation from further reincarnation, while requiring the recipient to maintain the ritual's demanding ascetic conditions for what was expected to be only a brief remaining span of hours or days before death naturally occurred, minimizing the practical risk of any subsequent moral lapse that might retroactively nullify the sacrament's spiritual benefits. This practical pattern of deathbed reception, however theologically sensible from the perspective of ordinary believers seeking to maximize their prospects for the guaranteed spiritual liberation the consolamentum promised, while minimizing the genuine practical difficulty of permanently maintaining its demanding requirements, would eventually produce one of the most historically striking and, to modern audiences, genuinely unsettling practices documented anywhere within Cathar religious tradition, a practice that emerged directly from the theologically awkward circumstance of a dying believer who received the consolamentum in apparent anticipation of imminent death, only to then experience the medically fortunate but theologically troubling circumstance of unexpected physical recovery. Before turning to that specific practice in the following episode, it is worth pausing to consider how the consolamentum functioned as a genuinely distinctive theological and administrative solution to a problem every religious tradition promising ultimate salvation must eventually confront. How does an ordinary, imperfect human being, incapable of sustaining perfect moral discipline across an entire lifetime, nonetheless achieve the spiritual purity a given tradition holds necessary for ultimate salvation or liberation? Orthodox Catholic theology addressed this problem through an ongoing sacramental system, confession, penance, and absolution repeated throughout a believer's life, allowing for repeated moral failure and repeated spiritual restoration across an entire lifespan of ordinary human imperfection. Cathar theology, by contrast, effectively concentrated this entire problem into a single decisive moment, timed as close to death as circumstances allowed, precisely in order to minimize the window during which the recipient's inevitable human fallibility might undo the spiritual achievement the ritual conferred. This was, in its own way, a genuinely elegant solution to a hard theological problem, though, as the following episode will demonstrate, it was a solution whose elegance depended entirely on death actually arriving on schedule, and whose failure to do so created one of the more genuinely difficult ethical and pastoral dilemmas documented anywhere in medieval religious history. The theological structure of the consolamentum, examined in detail in the previous episode, created a genuinely severe practical dilemma for any believer who received the ritual while apparently on their deathbed, only to subsequently experience unexpected medical recovery, a circumstance that, however statistically infrequent it may have been given medieval medical conditions, and the genuine severity of illness that typically prompted deathbed reception of the sacrament in the first place nonetheless occurred with sufficient regularity to produce a distinctive and historically documented secondary practice within Cathar religious tradition, known as the endura. The underlying theological problem this circumstance created was genuinely severe within the internal logic of Cathar belief. A believer who had received the consolamentum while apparently dying, and who consequently now carried the full, permanently binding obligation to maintain complete perfecti-level ascetic discipline for the remainder of their natural life, faced an entirely different and considerably more demanding practical challenge if that life turned out, through unexpected recovery, to extend for months, years, or even decades further, rather than the brief remaining hours or days that had originally been anticipated when the ritual was administered. Maintaining permanent celibacy and comprehensive dietary restriction across a genuinely extended remaining lifespan, without any of the gradual preparation, community support structures, or personal commitment that individuals who deliberately chose to become perfecti under ordinary healthy circumstances typically possessed, represented a genuinely difficult practical and psychological challenge that not every unexpectedly recovering believer felt confident of successfully sustaining. The specific fear this circumstance generated within Cathar theological understanding was that a recovering believer, having received the full spiritual benefit and guaranteed liberation the consolamentum promised, might subsequently fail to maintain its demanding requirements through resumed sexual activity, consumption of prohibited foods, or other lapses from strict perfecti discipline, thereby retroactively nullifying the sacrament's spiritual benefits and returning the unfortunate believer to precisely the spiritually unresolved condition, subject to continued reincarnation, that the ritual had been specifically intended to permanently resolve. From this specific theological perspective, unexpected physical recovery after receiving the consolamentum represented not straightforwardly good fortune, but a genuinely serious spiritual risk that some believers and their surrounding religious community determined required active, deliberate management. The practice that emerged to address this specific theological dilemma, known as the endura, involved the recovering believer voluntarily continuing to refuse food and water, effectively completing through deliberate, sustained fasting what illness had originally been expected to accomplish, thereby ensuring that death occurred before any opportunity arose for a lapse in the strict ascetic discipline the consolamentum required, and preserving intact the ritual's guaranteed spiritual liberation rather than risking its potential nullification through an extended period of difficult, uncertain ascetic discipline that the believer or their community judged too risky to attempt sustaining across a genuinely open-ended remaining lifespan. It is important, in presenting this historical practice, to represent accurately how Cathar believers themselves appear to have understood and framed it, based on the available historical evidence, while also maintaining appropriate historical distance from any suggestion that this framing should be read as straightforwardly endorsing the underlying practice by modern standards. Within Cathar religious understanding, the endura was not conceived or presented as an act of despair or as what modern understanding would classify as suicide motivated by hopelessness. It was understood instead as a deliberate, spiritually purposeful act of continued religious discipline undertaken specifically to preserve and protect a spiritual liberation already sacramentally secured, framed by the community and the individual undertaking it as the completion of a spiritual journey rather than its abandonment. Family members and fellow believers reportedly maintained a supportive presence at the bedside of individuals undertaking the endura, offering encouragement and spiritual support intended to help the person maintain their resolve through what would, by any account, have been a genuinely difficult physical ordeal involving progressive physical deterioration over a period that historical accounts suggest typically extended across multiple days before death occurred. Modern historians studying this practice approach it with the kind of careful, evidence-based historical analysis appropriate to any genuinely difficult and ethically complex historical topic, generally noting that the endura appears to have been practiced by only a relatively small subset of individuals who found themselves in the specific theological circumstance of unexpected recovery following deathbed reception of the consolamentum, rather than representing a routine or widely expected element of ordinary Cathar religious practice for the broader community of believers. It nonetheless stands as one of the more historically striking and theologically distinctive practices documented within the broader Cathar religious tradition, illustrating with particular clarity just how thoroughly and consistently the movement's core dualist cosmology, treating physical existence itself as a form of demonic imprisonment, could shape the most intimate and consequential decisions its most committed adherents made regarding their own mortality and the ultimate spiritual fate of their souls. By the closing decades of the 12th century, the Catholic Church centered in Rome had grown genuinely and increasingly alarmed by Catharism's continued expansion and deepening popular entrenchment throughout Languedoc society, a concern that extended well beyond narrow theological disagreement into genuine anxiety regarding the movement's broader implications for ecclesiastical authority, institutional finances, and the underlying political and social order that the Catholic Church's institutional position throughout medieval Europe depended upon. Cathar theology's rejection of core Catholic doctrine extended well beyond the dualist cosmology and ascetic practices examined in this series' earlier episodes into direct, explicit rejection of central Catholic sacraments and institutional claims. Cathar teaching rejected the Catholic Eucharist, the sacrament in which consecrated bread and wine were understood by Orthodox Catholic doctrine to become the actual body and blood of Christ, on grounds directly consistent with the broader Cathar dualist framework. Since bread and wine were material, physical substances belonging to the evil principle's created domain, they could not, in Cathar theological reasoning, be transformed into anything genuinely sacred or spiritually efficacious, regardless of whatever ritual words or ecclesiastical authority Catholic clergy invoked in the attempt. Cathar teaching similarly rejected the Christian cross as an appropriate object of religious veneration, holding that an instrument specifically designed and used for physical torture and execution represented an entirely inappropriate symbol for genuine spiritual devotion, however central the cross had become to virtually every dimension of Orthodox medieval Catholic religious practice and visual culture. Perhaps most provocatively, some Cathar teaching and preaching reportedly characterized the institutional Catholic Church itself in terms drawing on the biblical Book of Revelation's imagery of the Whore of Babylon, framing Rome's ecclesiastical hierarchy not merely as mistaken or corrupted, but as an active instrument of the evil principle's ongoing dominion over the material world. Beyond these theological disagreements, Catharism's practical economic implications for the institutional Catholic Church proved genuinely significant and directly threatening to ecclesiastical financial interests throughout Languedoc. Cathar believers, rejecting the theological authority and sacramental legitimacy of the Catholic clergy, correspondingly refused to pay the tithes, the mandatory religious taxes owed to support the local Catholic Church and its clergy, that provided a substantial portion of ordinary ecclesiastical revenue throughout medieval Catholic Europe. As Catharism's popular following expanded throughout Languedoc, the corresponding erosion of tithe revenue represented a direct and increasingly significant financial threat to Catholic ecclesiastical institutions operating throughout the region. This religious and economic challenge was compounded by genuine political complications, since a significant portion of the regional aristocracy throughout Languedoc, including prominent noble houses such as the Counts of Toulouse, who ruled substantial territory across the region, extended varying degrees of tacit protection and tolerance to Cathar communities operating within their territories, motivated by some combination of genuine personal sympathy for Cathar teaching, family and social connections to Cathar believers and perfecti, and calculated political interest in maintaining a degree of regional autonomy from the increasingly assertive centralizing authority that both the French crown to the north and the Catholic papacy in Rome were, during this same period, working to extend more comprehensively across previously more independent regional territories throughout France. Pope Innocent III, elected to the papacy in 1198 and generally recognized by historians studying the medieval papacy as one of its most assertive and politically ambitious occupants, came to regard the continued spread of Catharism throughout Languedoc as an urgent and existential institutional threat, reportedly characterizing the movement in terms comparing it to a cancer that required decisive, comprehensive intervention before it could metastasize further across broader Christian Europe. Innocent's initial response to this perceived threat favored persuasion over coercion, dispatching learned Catholic preachers, most notably the Spanish churchman Dominic de Guzman, who would later found the Dominican religious order, specifically to engage Cathar teachers and believers in direct theological debate and disputation, intended to demonstrate Catholic doctrine's superior theological validity and thereby persuade Cathar believers to return to Orthodox Catholic religious practice. This initial strategy of theological persuasion proved, according to the consistent testimony of contemporary sources, largely ineffective, frustrated by several compounding factors that contemporary Catholic observers themselves acknowledged with evident discomfort. Cathar perfecti proved to be skilled, sophisticated theological debaters, well-versed in scriptural argument, and capable of mounting genuinely challenging responses to Catholic theological claims. More damagingly for the Catholic cause, the visible contrast between the perfecti's evident personal poverty, moral discipline, and ascetic lifestyle, and the frequently more comfortable, materially secure, and in some documented instances, outright corrupt conduct of the contemporary Catholic clergy operating in the same region undermined the persuasive force of Catholic theological argument, regardless of its formal doctrinal merits. Since ordinary observers throughout Languedoc society could directly and repeatedly observe which religious community's members actually appeared to live according to the ascetic Christian ideals both traditions nominally professed to value. Dominic de Guzman's own personal response to this frustrating pattern deserves particular historical attention, since it would eventually produce consequences extending far beyond his immediate missionary efforts in Languedoc. Recognizing that Cathar perfecti had won considerable popular respect, specifically through their visible practice of poverty and asceticism, Dominic adopted a deliberately similar approach in his own preaching campaigns, traveling on foot, renouncing personal wealth and comfortable accommodation, and modeling for his Catholic audiences precisely the kind of visible ascetic discipline that had previously given Cathar preachers such a significant persuasive advantage. This strategic innovation, born directly out of the practical failure to counter Cathar popular appeal through theological argument alone, would eventually crystallize into the founding principles of the Dominican religious order, formally established in 1216 and dedicated from its inception to a combination of rigorous theological education and visible, demonstrated poverty, specifically intended to compete with and eventually surpass the popular respect that ascetic heretical preachers, like the Cathar perfecti, had proven capable of attracting throughout the preceding decades. In this specific sense, one of the most historically significant and enduring institutions of the medieval Catholic Church owes at least part of its founding inspiration directly to the competitive pressure that Cathar religious practice had placed on conventional Catholic missionary and pastoral method throughout Languedoc during this critical period. Having concluded that theological persuasion alone would not succeed in reversing Catharism's continued popular and political entrenchment throughout Languedoc, Pope Innocent III shifted toward a strategy of direct political and coercive pressure, dispatching a personal papal representative named Pierre de Castelnau to the region specifically charged with compelling the local aristocracy, and particularly Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, the region's most powerful and politically significant noble ruler, to actively cooperate in suppressing Cathar communities operating within their respective territories, rather than continuing to extend the tacit toleration and protection these noble families had previously maintained. Castelnau's negotiations with Raymond VI, conducted across an extended and evidently increasingly tense diplomatic engagement, ultimately failed to produce the comprehensive cooperation Innocent III's papal directive demanded. Raymond VI, whatever combination of genuine personal reluctance to violently persecute significant portions of his own subject population and calculated political interest in preserving his substantial regional autonomy, actually motivated his position, declined to commit to the systematic, comprehensive campaign of persecution against his own Cathar-sympathizing subjects that Castelnau's papal mandate required of him. This diplomatic failure produced immediate and dramatic escalation. Castelnau formally excommunicated Raymond VI from the Catholic Church, a genuinely severe ecclesiastical penalty carrying substantial practical political consequences in a deeply Catholic medieval society, and prepared to return to Rome to report the failure of his diplomatic mission and recommend more forceful papal intervention. On the morning of January 14, 1208, as Castelnau travelled by horseback on his return journey toward Rome, he was assassinated, struck down by an unknown assailant in an attack that surviving contemporary accounts describe as sudden and apparently premeditated. The identity and specific motivations of Castelnau's actual killer have never been definitively established through the surviving historical record, and modern historians studying this event generally note that the available evidence does not conclusively establish direct responsibility on the part of Raymond VI or any other specific individual or faction. Despite Pope Innocent III's immediate and unambiguous public attribution of responsibility for the murder directly to Raymond VI, and by extension to the broader Cathar community and its aristocratic protectors throughout Languedoc. Whatever the actual, historically unresolved truth regarding who specifically bore responsibility for Castelnau's murder, its practical political and historical consequences proved immediate, dramatic, and genuinely catastrophic for the entire subsequent history of Languedoc and its Cathar population. Innocent III seized upon the assassination as precisely the kind of unambiguous, publicly justifiable pretext for military intervention that his administration had evidently been seeking for some time, formally declaring a crusade, a term and institutional mechanism previously associated almost exclusively with military campaigns directed against Muslim-controlled territories in the Eastern Mediterranean, but now, in a genuinely unprecedented and historically significant expansion of the crusading concept, directed instead against fellow Christians residing within European territory itself. This declaration carried genuinely significant practical implications that extended well beyond its immediate religious justification. Participants in a formally declared crusade received specific spiritual benefits under Catholic doctrine, including plenary indulgence, the formal remission of temporal punishment for sin, that had previously motivated substantial voluntary participation in crusading campaigns directed against Muslim territories in the Holy Land. Extending these same spiritual incentives to a military campaign directed against fellow Christians within France itself provided Innocent III with a powerful recruitment mechanism, offering substantial numbers of northern French nobility and their military retinues genuine religious and, as subsequent episodes will document, considerable material incentive to participate in what would become known to history as the Albigensian Crusade, named after the southern French town of Albi, one of the significant centres of Cathar religious activity throughout the broader Languedoc region. The specific timing and political convenience of this declaration deserves particular historical attention, since it aligned with broader strategic interests, extending well beyond the papacy's immediate religious concerns regarding Cathar heresy. Northern French nobility had long regarded the wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and politically autonomous territories of Languedoc with considerable acquisitive interest, and the formal crusading mechanism Innocent III's declaration established provided these northern nobles with a religiously sanctioned pretext for military conquest and territorial acquisition that a more conventional campaign of naked territorial ambition could never have provided with comparable moral and political legitimacy. This convergence of genuine religious motivation among at least some participants with considerably more mundane territorial and political ambition among others would prove, as the following episode's examination of the Crusade's actual conduct will demonstrate, one of the defining and most historically consequential features of the entire 20-year campaign that followed. It is worth considering, in concluding this episode, the genuinely unusual and historically significant precedent that Innocent III's specific decision established for the future development of crusading warfare as an institution within medieval Christendom. Prior to 1208, the crusading mechanism, with its specific package of spiritual indulgence, formal papal sanction, and structured military recruitment, had been directed exclusively outward against non-Christian powers controlling territory the papacy regarded as rightfully belonging to Christian rule, most prominently the various Crusader campaigns directed at Muslim-controlled Jerusalem and the broader Levant. By redirecting this same institutional mechanism inward, against a population that identified itself as Christian even while rejecting specific elements of Catholic Orthodox doctrine, Innocent III established a genuinely consequential precedent that subsequent medieval and early modern Catholic authorities would draw upon repeatedly in later centuries whenever internal religious dissent within nominally Christian territory reached a scale judged to require comparable military suppression. The Albigensian Crusade was not, in this sense, simply an isolated response to the specific circumstances of Cathar heresy in Languedoc. It represented the founding template for an entirely new category of internal religious warfare that would recur in various modified forms across the subsequent history of European religious conflict for centuries to come. The Albigensian Crusade, launched formally in 1209 and continuing across 2 decades of sustained military campaigning until its eventual conclusion in 1229, represents one of the most sustained and, by the standards even of a genuinely violent medieval world, exceptionally brutal campaigns of religious warfare and civilian suppression documented anywhere in medieval European history. Pope Innocent III's crusading declaration offered participating northern French nobility a genuinely powerful practical incentive beyond spiritual reward. The formal promise that any territory and property confiscated from Cathar believers and their aristocratic protectors throughout Languedoc would become the legitimate possession of whichever crusading nobles successfully conquered it, an arrangement that transformed the campaign, for many of its northern French participants, into a genuinely attractive opportunity for territorial acquisition and personal enrichment operating under the protective sanction of formal religious sacred warfare. The Crusade's first major military engagement at the southern French town of Béziers in July of 1209 established a pattern of indiscriminate mass violence that would characterize much of the subsequent 2-decade campaign. Béziers' population included both Catholic and Cathar residents, living together in ordinary mixed community, and when crusading commanders reportedly asked the papal representative accompanying the military expedition how they should distinguish between Catholic and Cathar residents before conducting the planned assault on the town. The response attributed to this representative, preserved in Latin as "Cedit eos," "Novit enim Dominus qui sunt eius," generally translated as "kill them all, God will know his own," has become one of the most historically notorious statements associated with the entire crusade, whatever specific uncertainty exists among historians regarding its precise verbatim accuracy and exact attribution. Whatever the exact historical accuracy of this specific quoted statement, the subsequent conduct of the crusading force at Béziers reflected precisely the indiscriminate violence the statement describes. Crusading soldiers stormed the town and killed its population without meaningful attempt to distinguish between Catholic and Cathar residents, including individuals who had sought sanctuary within the town's Catholic churches, under the reasonable assumption that consecrated religious space would provide protection from military violence. Historical estimates of the resulting death toll, while subject to the kind of scholarly uncertainty that inevitably attends medieval demographic and casualty figures, generally suggest a massacre claiming somewhere in the range of 15 to 20,000 men, women and children within a single day of sustained violence. The crusade continued across the following 2 decades under the military leadership of Simon de Montfort, a northern French nobleman whose personal military and political ambition, combined with genuine religious conviction regarding the necessity of suppressing Cathar heresy, made him one of the Crusade's most consistently active and, according to numerous surviving contemporary accounts, brutally effective military commanders. De Montfort's campaigns across Languedoc involved the systematic destruction of towns and villages suspected of harbouring Cathar sympathisers, mass executions of captured populations, and, in numerous documented instances, deliberately terrorizing mutilation of captured prisoners, specifically intended to intimidate remaining Cathar communities and their aristocratic protectors into surrender or abandonment of their continued resistance. The Crusade's ultimate military and political outcome proved comprehensively successful from the perspective of both the Catholic papacy's religious objectives and the northern French nobility's territorial ambitions, though the human cost throughout Languedoc society, encompassing both committed Cathar believers and the substantial Catholic population that had continued living alongside them throughout the region for generations, proved genuinely catastrophic by any measure available to historians studying this period. The formerly autonomous political and cultural world of Languedoc, previously governed by regional noble families like the Counts of Toulouse, who had maintained genuine independence from direct French royal authority, was progressively absorbed into direct territorial control by the French crown across the Crusade's 2 decades of sustained military campaigning, formally integrating the region into the expanding French royal domain in a process that historians studying French national political development consistently identify as one of the more significant milestones in medieval France's gradual territorial and political consolidation under increasingly centralized royal authority. For the Cathar religious community specifically, the Crusade's conclusion in 1229 did not represent the complete elimination the Catholic Church had originally sought to achieve through this sustained military campaign, but it did comprehensively destroy the political protection and relatively open, tolerated religious practice that Cathar communities had previously enjoyed throughout Languedoc under the region's former political autonomy. Surviving perfecti and their remaining communities of believers were forced into increasingly clandestine, underground religious practice, hiding their continued religious activity from the newly established French royal and Catholic ecclesiastical authorities now directly governing the region, setting the stage for the next, and in certain respects even more historically consequential, phase of the broader campaign against Catharism that the following episode will examine in detail. the establishment of a permanent, systematic ecclesiastical institution specifically designed to hunt down and eliminate whatever remained of the movement's underground religious network. The Albigensian Crusade's military conclusion in 1229 had comprehensively destroyed the political autonomy and aristocratic protection that had previously allowed Catharism to flourish relatively openly throughout Languedoc, but it had not, according to the consistent assessment of Catholic ecclesiastical authorities monitoring the situation in the years immediately following the Crusade's formal end, succeeded in eliminating the underlying religious movement itself. Substantial numbers of perfecti and their communities of ordinary believers continued practicing their faith, now operating clandestinely, concealing their religious identity and activity from the Catholic and French royal authorities who now directly governed the region in the Crusade's aftermath. Addressing this continued, if now considerably more concealed, religious threat required, from the perspective of Catholic ecclesiastical leadership, an entirely different institutional approach than the conventional military campaign that had already run its course. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX established a new, permanent ecclesiastical institution specifically designed for the systematic identification, investigation, and prosecution of suspected heretics. An institution that would become known to subsequent history as the Inquisition, and that represents one of the most historically significant and consequential administrative innovations in the entire history of the medieval Catholic Church. The specific institutional structure Gregory IX established placed primary operational responsibility for this new inquisitorial function in the hands of the Dominican religious order, the same order Dominic de Guzman had founded partly in response to his earlier, largely unsuccessful efforts at persuading Cathar believers back to Catholic orthodoxy through theological debate, examined in an earlier episode of this series. Dominican friars, trained specifically in theological education and, increasingly, in the specific investigative and judicial procedures the developing inquisitorial system required, served as the primary judges and investigators responsible for identifying and prosecuting suspected heretics throughout the territories where the institution operated. The Inquisition's specific investigative methodology, as it developed and became increasingly standardized across the following decades, relied heavily on the systematic cultivation of local informant networks throughout individual villages and communities, encouraging and in some cases requiring local populations to report suspicious behavior that might indicate continued Cathar religious practice, including specific attention to dietary patterns, since Cathar believers documented refusal to consume meat, eggs, or dairy products, particularly during periods when Catholic religious observance specifically called for their consumption, such as certain feast days, provided investigators with a relatively straightforward, observable behavioral marker that could identify households potentially harboring continued Cathar sympathy or practice. Perhaps the most historically significant and consequential procedural innovation the developing Inquisition introduced, relative to earlier medieval ecclesiastical and secular judicial practice, involved the formal papal authorization of physical torture as a legitimate investigative technique for extracting confessions and information regarding the identity of other suspected heretics from individuals brought before inquisitorial proceedings. This formal sanctioning of torture as a routine investigative tool represented a genuinely significant institutional development in the broader history of medieval judicial procedure, one whose influence and methodological legacy would extend, in various modified forms, across subsequent centuries of European ecclesiastical and secular judicial practice, well beyond the specific historical context of anti-Cathar persecution that had originally motivated its introduction. Individuals who confessed to heretical belief or practice when brought before inquisitorial proceedings, and who formally renounced that belief and returned to Orthodox Catholic practice, typically received penalties considerably less severe than execution, though still genuinely significant in their practical social and economic consequences. A common penalty involved the requirement to wear a distinctive yellow cross, permanently sewn onto the individual's clothing, for the remainder of their life, a visible, permanent marker of their previous heretical status, intended to subject the individual to ongoing social stigma and community surveillance, while also serving the practical function of making clear to the broader community which specific individuals had already been investigated and formally reconciled to orthodox practice. Individuals who refused to confess or renounce their heretical belief when brought before inquisitorial proceedings, or who were identified as relapsed heretics having previously confessed and renounced heresy only to subsequently return to it, faced considerably more severe consequences, up to and including formal condemnation to execution by burning, a penalty that Catholic ecclesiastical and civil authorities applied with particular consistency to identified perfecti, whose formal commitment to Cathar religious practice through the consolamentum ritual, examined earlier in this series, made them, in inquisitorial judgment, considerably less likely candidates for genuine renunciation and reconciliation than ordinary believers who had never undertaken this formal, permanently binding religious commitment. This systematic, village-by-village investigative apparatus proved, across the following several decades of sustained operation, genuinely effective at achieving what the preceding 2 decades of open military crusade had failed to fully accomplish: the progressive identification, prosecution, and elimination of the remaining underground Cathar religious network throughout Languedoc, steadily reducing the movement's surviving population of committed perfecti, and driving its remaining adherents into increasingly isolated, precarious circumstances that would culminate, as the following and final episode of this series will document, in one of the most historically dramatic and symbolically resonant conclusions to any religious movement's persecution documented anywhere in medieval European history. The broader historical legacy of the institutional Inquisition, established specifically to combat Catharism, deserves brief additional consideration, since the specific administrative and procedural innovations, first developed and refined in this particular historical context, would extend, in modified and considerably expanded form, across the following several centuries of European ecclesiastical and, eventually, secular judicial history. The systematic use of local informant networks, the standardized procedures for interrogation and confession extraction, and the formal legal categories distinguishing degrees of heretical culpability that Gregory IX's Inquisitorial Commission first developed for the specific purpose of eliminating Cathar belief throughout Languedoc, would later be adapted and applied to entirely different targets and contexts across subsequent centuries, including the considerably later and more extensively documented Spanish Inquisition established in 1478, which, while operating under separate institutional authority and directed at different specific religious populations, drew directly on the procedural template that the original 13th century campaign against Catharism had first established. In this sense, the institutional machinery this episode has examined represents not merely a historical footnote specific to the Cathar movement's particular fate, but a genuinely foundational development in the broader history of systematic religious persecution and judicial procedure throughout subsequent European history. By the early 1240s, the systematic combination of military conquest and sustained inquisitorial investigation examined across this series' preceding 2 episodes had reduced the once substantial and openly practiced Cathar religious movement throughout Languedoc to a small, increasingly desperate remnant population, concentrated in its final years primarily around a single, dramatically fortified mountain stronghold known as Montségur, situated atop a steep, naturally defensible peak in the Pyrenees foothills of southern France. Montségur had served for years as a genuine refuge and operational centre for the remaining Cathar perfecti and their surviving community of believers. Its formidable natural defensive position and remote location providing meaningful protection against the systematic investigation and prosecution that had already eliminated Cathar religious practice across most of the rest of Languedoc. By the early 1240s, the fortress sheltered a population historians estimate at approximately 400 individuals, including both remaining perfecti and a substantial community of ordinary believers, along with the military garrison responsible for the fortress's continued physical defense. In 1243, a substantial French royal military force, numbering according to various historical estimates somewhere in the range of 10,000 soldiers, arrived to besiege Montségur, recognizing the fortress as the final significant concentration of organized Cathar religious practice remaining anywhere in France, and determined to achieve the movement's final, comprehensive elimination through direct military conquest of its last remaining stronghold. The siege that followed extended across approximately 10 months of sustained military pressure, with Montségur's defenders mounting a genuinely determined resistance against a besieging force that vastly outnumbered them, sustained by the fortress's formidable natural defences and the evident determination of its defenders, both military and religious, to resist for as long as any realistic prospect of continued defence remained available to them. Ultimately, however, the combination of sustained military pressure, progressive exhaustion of the fortress's food and other essential supplies, and the spread of illness among the confined defending population proved decisive, and Montségur's defenders negotiated formal surrender terms in March of 1244. The specific terms of this negotiated surrender deserve careful attention, because they set the stage directly for the series' concluding and most historically resonant episode. Ordinary believers and non-religious military defenders were offered the opportunity to depart the fortress safely, without facing execution or other severe punishment, provided they formally renounced Cathar religious belief and practice. The identified perfecti among the fortress's population, however, faced a starkly different choice: formal renunciation of their faith, or execution by burning. The besieging force granted the fortress's population a 2-week period before requiring their final decision, and it was during this period that one of the most historically striking and psychologically significant developments of the entire episode occurred. According to the consistent testimony of surviving historical accounts, not a single one of the identified perfecti chose to renounce their faith in exchange for their life. More strikingly still, a number of ordinary believers who had not previously undertaken the full commitment of perfecti status reportedly requested and received the consolamentum ritual during this final 2-week period, specifically in order to formally join the ranks of those committed to execution, rather than accepting the safe departure that remained available to them as ordinary, non-perfecti believers. On March 16, 1244, more than 200 individuals who had refused to renounce their Cathar faith descended from Montségur's fortress toward a massive pyre that had been constructed and set ablaze at the base of the mountain specifically for their execution. Surviving historical accounts describe the condemned individuals walking to their deaths without evident coercion or resistance, several accounts specifically noting that many walked hand in hand as they approached the flames. This is, without question, one of the more genuinely difficult episodes in this entire series to present with appropriate historical care, and it deserves to be understood within its full, specific theological and historical context, rather than through any anachronistic modern framework that might either romanticize or inadequately register the genuine gravity of what this event actually represented. Within the specific theological framework this series has examined across its preceding episodes, these individuals understood themselves not as choosing death out of despair, but as completing a spiritual journey whose entire theological logic held that physical death represented liberation from bodily imprisonment, rather than a loss to be feared or avoided at any cost, including the cost of formally renouncing beliefs they held to be genuinely, ultimately true. Modern historians studying religious persecution and martyrdom across numerous different traditions and historical periods have consistently noted that this kind of sustained, communally supported commitment to religious conviction, even at the direct cost of one's own life, represents a recurring, if always historically and ethically weighty, pattern across the broader history of religious persecution, one that deserves careful, historically grounded understanding rather than either uncritical admiration or dismissive incomprehension. The executions at Montségur effectively eliminated the last significant organized concentration of Cathar perfecti anywhere in France, and while isolated individual practitioners and small underground communities continued surviving in increasingly precarious, clandestine circumstances for several additional decades following this event, the systematic combination of military conquest and sustained inquisitorial investigation this series has documented across its full 10 episodes had, by the early decades of the 14th century, achieved what Pope Innocent III had originally set out to accomplish more than a century earlier: the comprehensive elimination of Catharism as a living, organized religious tradition anywhere in medieval Europe, its distinctive theology, its demanding rituals of purification, and its startling final chapter at Montségur surviving only in the historical record that patient subsequent scholarship has worked to carefully reconstruct and understand. What remains, centuries later, is a genuinely difficult and instructive historical case study in the collision between sincere, deeply held religious conviction and the institutional power of a religious and political authority determined to enforce doctrinal uniformity across territory it claimed as rightfully its own. The Cathars left behind no surviving scriptures of their own composition, no continuing community of practice, and no direct institutional descendants. Everything modern historians know about their beliefs and practices has been painstakingly reconstructed from the records their persecutors kept, the confessions extracted under the very inquisitorial procedures examined in the previous episode, and the scattered testimony of contemporary observers writing from outside the tradition itself. That this reconstruction remains possible at all, more than 7 centuries after the flames at Montségur went out, stands as its own quiet testament to how thoroughly a movement that once commanded the sincere devotion of a substantial population across an entire region of medieval France can be reduced, through sustained and deliberate institutional effort, to little more than a cautionary case study preserved in the very archives its destroyers left behind.